Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So we have a small group today. Some of what we just called the kind of the core team, or some of the organizers for the upcoming um, Tikaranto and Great Lakes Basin bioregional activation tour, which is a little bit wordy. We could call it something different, but we're going to have a campfire today. Before we jump into conversation, I wanted to provide a little bit of a preamble, a little bit of a background. Um, for those of you who are watching the recording, may be interested in joining in the remaining 4 sessions. We're going to be doing these on Wednesdays and Saturdays during the entirety of the bioregional activation process, and I'll explain a little bit more about that here in a moment. First, I want to talk about the origin of campfires. Started in early 2020. I was in the Community Regenerators Training Program. My personal background is in landscape restoration. I was a farmer, rancher most of my 20s, and got into permaculture. A couple curveballs in life resulted in me joining the Earth Regenerators, becoming familiar with Joe's work, and becoming really interested in this idea of community regeneration, and sort of began to apply the design lens to this entirely new way of seeing the world, and this entirely different domain that was essential to see and to understand, in order to understand the larger predicament that we're all in with planetary collapse, and understanding the opportunities for regeneration. So it was in this time of joining the Community Regenerators Training Program, this cohort of people who were exploring this stuff along with Joe, diving into his work, that I also discovered the book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, and I can't recommend that book enough. It was a book that jostled and twisted and turned my worldview in so many ways that I'm still, I think, kind of grappling with, if you will. But the book talked a lot about the Australian Aboriginal cultures, and the many social technologies that enabled them to be arguably the most successful deep time continental scale land stewards in human history. Australia is a really challenging place to live and to steward the land. There are a number of reasons for this, and I'll briefly touch on a couple. Hey, Paul, good to see you. Been a little while. Talking a little bit about the background of campfires and the yarn. So this is a history you're familiar with. So the reason why Australia is so challenging to steward is that it broke off from Antarctica and slowly drifted north, coming from really far southern latitudes. And this particular band of the Earth has a very low overall precipitation. And so Australia, over a period of like hundreds of millions of years, has received very low precipitation. And to make matters more challenging, there are no mountains in the middle of the continent. Salt does not drain away. It accumulates, and the ecological processes have found a way around that particular challenge, and that is creating a lens of moisture on the top that suppresses that layer of salt. But when there are poor land management practices, when that lens of water is disrupted, salt rises to the surface, and that is the part of the explanation for a lot of the pictures that I've seen over the course of my life of these very salted landscapes in Australia. So it's amongst that particular context that the Australian Aborigines developed this continental scale culture that allowed them to live in relative abundance and peace for 50,000 years. And so I think it's a lot the adaptive pressures that resulted in these particular technologies. And I think we have, given our context, a lot that we can learn from them. So one of these social technologies is the yarn, is the inspiration for these campfires. And Tyson Yunkaporta says about the yarn, they're a modality that arose out of distributed governance in an attempt to form distributed cognition. He says that a yarn aims to build the big picture and make accurate predictions moving forward, so that a group can make plans that might work in the real world. Every person's story must be heard because the truth exists in the aggregate of all stories. Even the outliers are important to hear. And the last part of that last sentence, I think, clearly points to the value of diversity. So that's kind of an interesting side note I wanted to bring in. And so that brings us to campfires. Inspired by the social technology, inspired by the need to explore adaptive social technologies in the pursuit of understanding community regeneration better, we created spaces in the Earth Regenerators where we would come together in conversation and playfully and hopefully humbly try to invoke the spirit of the yarn, adapt what was adaptation in our particular context, being a virtual group of people from around the planet who care about Earth regeneration, very different than what you saw in Australia over the last 50,000 years. But nonetheless, we move forward, and I hosted a few times a week for a very long time, a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. Along that period of time, relationships were forming. We started to really feel into the value of forming deep relationships, even though it was in a virtual context. And I think that a shared understanding of our story began to emerge somewhat. Over the last year, I've stepped away from campfires largely. I have to thank a small and dedicated group of firekeepers who've kept the fire burning. And now I hope to host campfires again in different contexts with new people, use it as a bit of a more experimental container, if you will. And that brings us to the experiment that we're running over these 6 sessions, today being the second of the 6. And that is to explore how this open conversational container can serve the Great Lakes Basin during this process of bioregional activation. The first public talk, I think, is Monday. So we met on this past Wednesday and today, we're before the bioregional activations. And as Penny and Joe begin to travel through and do these workshops, meet lots of people, they may be pointing people in our direction. So we'll see if these grow a lot. We might just sort of be, working the foundation of what is to come, sort of setting the stage, if you will. But how can this be, if people begin to land here, a space where lots of relationships within the Great Lakes Basin can be woven that wouldn't otherwise, within people's bioregions and across the entire region, and with people who are here virtually. Paul, for example, is in the Salish Sea region. I'm right now in Phoenix. So how can we support as well? But primarily, how can people in those bioregions come together? And then how can important topics surface that otherwise might not? How can we lean into the spontaneity of these spaces and lean on the invisible structures that are formed in campfires to create the space where we can really explore narratives, important topics and themes. And so with that, I just want to say a couple more things on the structure of this space. This is not a concern today, but anytime the group gets over like 7-8 people, I'm going to break them into smaller groups so that we can really focus on forming real relationships. If there's too many people in the group, I feel like I don't really make strong connections. And then also with a smaller group, I find that the dialogue can maintain more continuity and coherence, which I think is really important as we practice collective intelligence to always consider the, if you will, this is a technical term, the topology of the conversation. How does it move through topics, and does it make sense, and does it go somewhere? But we don't need to use breakout rooms today because there's just a small group here. But if the groups do get larger, we'll do the breakout rooms, and then we'll end around what I like to call the big fire to share whatever emerged. And with that, ramble hopefully wasn't too long. I'd love to do check-ins, and in the check-in, just share what's been coming up for you lately. If you can think specifically towards the Great Lakes Basin bioregional activations and inquiries that you have around that process, I would welcome that. Although if there's something else that's really pressing for you, bring that in. And hopefully through the process of check-ins, we can then sort of sense into where the dialogue wants to begin. And so I am all set with my preamble. Does anybody want to start us off with check-ins? And then pass it along?
Sure. So Victoria will kick off the check-in for us.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this new campfire. I haven't been on one, and to have it be dedicated to the kind of process that we're taking on in the Great Lakes and specifically in the Rochester area. Every time I get on one of these kinds of calls, I'm learning something. So I'll be on virtually if I could figure out how to get my own thing rather than Jonathan's thing. That's why I went back and forth. Sorry. Go ahead. You go.
Yes. So we are kind of right in the middle of the eye of the storm here with getting the trip with Joe and Penny organized. And it's actually going pretty well. Part of what has happened for me is that I did not anticipate activating anything to do with the bioregion right away, because we have local projects, we have global projects, and I didn't feel that we were really ready to start this bioregional conversation. But the fact of Joe and Penny coming here, coming first to Toronto and then to Cleveland and Rochester, means that we've actually kicked off a conversation that seems to have a life of its own. And so I might not be ready for it, but the world is ready for it. So I'm having really a lot of fun with these conversations with the people who show up. We've really made our relationships with some of the people that we know locally have become much stronger as a result of it. And so that's a pretty happy outcome. So let me pass it along to Preston.
Thanks, John. It's interesting that sort of eye of the storm comment, and thinking a little bit about the reference to Tyson Yunkaporta's book, because similarly, although I haven't been participating with those regenerators for near the amount of time Benji has, that same book, sort of the same impetus, having been on here, sort of really shook me into how to approach moving forward in life. The ability to take in a lot of different perspectives, much broader, wider perspectives, to the point of worldviews. It was a very good kickoff for me, and it's really shifted a lot of how I'm approaching things. I think probably more subtly than I'm aware of. The part about the eye of the storm, and it sort of ties into the comment about the importance of a variety of voices. I've always found myself being out on the periphery. I can see a lot of the centerpieces, I can see a lot of the silos, and I can see the things that should be connecting them, but nobody is quite willing to listen to those conversations. Everybody's too busy. They're very centered on their expertise, which I totally understand, but at the same time, so being out on that edge has been a sort of a difficult place to be. And now I'm not sure how close to the center this might be, or back towards that edge. And I think I'm having a lot of struggle right now with how that process is going to unfold, where I'm going to be in that until it actually manifests. That, and it's February, we're on the verge of February, so it's dark time of the year. The weather's not been doing great. It's hard to sort of manage through these times. And my partner's been away for 2 weeks on a business trip, so it's been a lot of quiet. A lot of quiet time. So as much as everything should be very exciting right now, somehow I'm struggling with the other side of the equation, when it's the last thing I actually want to be struggling with at the moment. So that's what I am bringing into this here in this moment, and I'll hand it off to Paul.
Good morning, or good afternoon, as the case may be. I don't think I've actually chatted, Preston. I've seen you floating around Earth Regenerators, but I don't think we've actually met. So pleasure to meet you. And I think Jonathan and Victoria and I have had some sort of side conversations here and there, not for a while though. And Benji has been the master firekeeper, and his opening presentation blurbs are getting slicker and slicker every week. you should. So it's I'm just glad to be here. I'm procrastinating right now. I have a whole bunch of stuff that I've thought I could do this weekend. My daughter's coming back in the evening. She's off in college and she's passing through town for a week, which is nice. And I've been thinking a lot in my projects, and in the restoration industry in the Salish Sea, but try and weave that into everything I can. And I've been struggling with the power of personal invitation. That's kind of my challenge right now. That I want to build systems that go by themselves. I want to inoculate people that then causes them to, go off and do things. Instead, what I find is that I am more effective when I greet people, hold their hand, look in their eyes, and ask them to do something with me personally, and then that leads to something, right? And so, but the problem is, if you're trying to do that with 400 people, it's very tiring. And so I'm trying to. It's I think I've been spoiled by automation, maybe, is one possibility. And I'm kind of just struggling with that, trying to make sense of that, because that I'm trying to build things without having the attendant infrastructure, without having the social cultural infrastructure. And so therefore it takes more labor to do anything when you don't have all the infrastructure in place. But I'm trying to build the infrastructure. It's kind of a chicken or the egg thing I'm finding as I try and create new things or new events or new patterns, where the power of personal invitation is so important and so burdensome at the same time. So I'm just working through that.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's really good to see you. And
I'd
it's been a
love
long
to-
time.
Oh, I think, is the protocol to raise your hand?
Nah. Then she will keep you in line.
Yeah.
I love what you're saying.
I've been around the block. I got to keep people. If you don't mind, Victoria, just 1 second. I'm gonna do a check-in, and then with a group this small, we don't really need to use the raise the hand feature, unless we get unruly, which is fine. These things take on a life of their own sometimes. But typically, just we pause in campfires a bit after people talk to let people sort of think about things and let things come up. But we don't pounce on the pause. We try not to, as one of our invisible cultural protocols. Yeah. All right. Nice. But this is like sitting around a campfire, basically, is the feel that we try to conjure up. But with that, I'll go into a brief intro myself, try to keep it brief, and then we'll jump into conversation. The thing that I want to share is just the bizarre, and it's funny that you're here, Paul, because you're one of the first people to really get me thinking about this, and that is the limitations and the bizarre nature of the virtual. And Tyson Yunkaporta actually is another person who's brought this up a lot and made me think a lot about it. But as two huge things are about to happen in my life, we're supporting the Great Lakes Basin, and this is just this really deeply exciting experience. And I'm working so closely with Joe and Penny, and they're getting ready to jump on a plane, and they're doing all these talks, and they're going to meet all these people, and they're going to be pointing so many people in our direction. Yet I'm here in Phoenix, mediated through this little device, that I close and sometimes I lose track of. I don't even know where my computer is. And so much of that story is almost exclusively through this medium and through my phone, through voice memos with Joe and Penny. And in addition to that, we're getting ready to launch the Design School for Regenerating Earth on March 1st, which is hugely exciting. And so much of that work is, around Joe and Penny and in Barichara and related to the Barichara Ecoversity. And so it's also right now conceptual for me. And as we've had so many conversations about embodiment and how the process of us all adapting to be more bioregional will be a process of changing the very way that we experience reality, how we move through the world, importance of relationships, reconnecting of everything. Here I am completely disconnected and doing all of this embodiment mediated through abstraction and this conceptual world. So it's like this bizarre paradox that I'm living out right now. And honestly, I think it's a lesson, because more and more I see that there is so much dysfunction and delusion in groups of people who do just meet online and don't ever get to the ground. And there's so many assumptions about what's happening in those spaces that are just conceptual, I think. And I think people tend to trick themselves, me included. I've done it a lot in the past. And I think that by the internet and the way we connect on the internet is going to be such a big part of the planetary, like forming a planetary network of bioregions. I think it's really important that we understand the subtle constraints of the virtual and understand the importance of embodiment and how much that is limited in this space. So I don't know if that's, hopefully that's not too heady, but it's just really alive for me. And I just wanted to bring that in.
Mhm.
And I don't know if at this stage, I don't know if you guys are feeling a particular place to start the conversation. I do want to, if we wander away from the Great Lakes, I want to try to reinvoke it and bring it back, because I do feel like we are in service to this process that's forming. But with that said, we can meander wherever we want. I'm just going to hold that intention.
Can you say a little bit more about what it means for you to be embodying these things as opposed to being engaged in a conversation virtually?
Yeah. That, in a way, it's like, it's so simple. It's hard to even talk about. There's a lot of paradox in it, talking about it in a conceptual way, but community art might be a good example. And this, I'm going to do some try talking here, because this is a really hard thing to talk about. I haven't quite figured out how to do it. But as I have conversations with Claire about community art, she talks so eloquently about the process of inviting people into participation, and how once it becomes embodied, once it's experiential, people can really, they really take in the importance of having conversations about local identity together, and it becomes part of them, and then it informs so much of what they're doing and so much of how they see place. And so it's the experience of actually beginning that process that makes us bioregional. And as long as we're talking about it conceptually, we can't take the next steps forward. I'm not satisfied with that answer, but I don't, man, Joe can speak to this far more eloquently than I can, but it's something that like strikes me a lot. It's like, oh, wow, that's just one of those things you just have to do, and then you'll get it. As long as we're sitting on a Zoom screen, we can't do it. I don't know if that helps. Hard to talk about.
My feeling is it's always it's about commitment on some level, and and having back to ideas like skin in the game, is part of it in my mind. I was just thinking, I live in a co-housing community in West Olympia here, and there was someone in the neighborhood wants to sort of join the co-housing community as a member and participate more. And on the surface, that sounds like a great thing, but on the other hand, like one of the ways that we are a co-housing community is that we've sunk, $500,000 of our life savings into this shared infrastructure that we have to maintain together. And that if it falls apart or it breaks, it's on us, and we have to maintain it. We have to take care of it. And we don't really have a choice, because we have become embodied, like our relationship is embodied in this shared space. And so another reaction, and there's a variety of reactions to this outsider wanting to come in. It's like, okay, well, deed your house to our collective, and then you're in, right? It's like, it's not just about like a piece of paper and sign the paper and then you're one of us or something, but it's like we're together because we have shared infrastructure we threw in with each other in a way that we can't avoid. We can't sell it. Now because it's a modern colonial industrial society, we can sell our share and move on to own another piece of land. But you can't. If you're in a bioregion, there's a kind to fully engage and recognize that you're in a bioregion means you don't get to escape except by leaving behind that sense of home. So there's a loss and risk involved in becoming bioregional, I think. It's harder to grapple with.
Yeah, Preston.
Just having a thought about, you were talking very specifically about the virtual world and the abstraction versus the embodiment, that boots on the ground, the direct relations there. But I don't think those are near as far apart as one might think. And it sort of touches in on Paul's aspect too. He has somebody coming in who doesn't carry the narrative, the whole mindset, the framework, the scaffolding of what the reality is, but sees a small piece of it and is interested in that small piece. And the thing is to try to communicate through across all that amount of information so that the other person shares that whole picture. And it's a very long journey, but this is actually the reality in all these different scenarios, in that think about the point of view of construction, because I had done so much renovating of houses and such. When I walk through a space, when I look at a wall, when I look at a space, a room, etc., I see all the components that are there. I see the fact that it's just drywall on studs or plaster on brick. I can see that there's electrical running to those outlets. I know that the trim is there to cover the gap between the framing and the door. All these things are pieces that I know, having experienced that sort of framework. However, when I talk to other people that have never been in construction, they just see a wall. I walked somebody through who was originally from India. They didn't want to have trims in the renovation. They wanted it to be clean. And I said, it's possible, but trying to find the expertise to be able to achieve that, because really that trim is there to hide an issue that's a fast solve with a trim. If you take that trim away and you want it perfect, now you have to find somebody that can finish that wall to that door in such a way that you don't need to have that to cover up that gap. You'll have to go find some, people that has extreme expertise in those areas. The thing is, it's that aspect of the worlds that we have created in our mind versus where we need to be at some point in time. And we all carry these very, very different constructs of what the reality is. And the reality we live in right now is not a functional, sustainable, long-term reality at all. But we're also living in it. We're trying to survive through it. We're trying to find a way to make these things work. And the people that are rushing, trying to, make ends meet as costs go up and all these things happening, they're so busy with all their little pieces, they don't have time to step back and sort of begin to understand that the shifts in perspective, the shifts in understanding, what all those systemic moving parts are. And so there's that aspect there. And so I don't think it's about really just being a virtual world. It's about the constructs of the mind that we create all these things in, and getting people to make those transitions. And everybody's moving at it from a different place and a different framework. And so it's intensely complex. And then you throw on top of that the mix of politics and misinformation and all kinds of angry stuff and distractions. And anyway, that was sort of where, and I think the Tyson Young Kaporta stuff was great because it gave me a chance to live in somebody else's world for a little while in a whole global perspective. He broke it down in, the rise and falls of civilizations, the comings and goings historically of things. We don't spend time looking at those pictures. We're trying to get food on the table tomorrow, wondering where the hell the mortgage is coming from, all those aspects. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out how that journey is. And obviously on places like this where you can really get into those nuts and bolts and talk to people about it, because these aren't conversations you have walking up and down the street here.
I think I have a direction that we can go that brings it back to the Great Lakes, the bioregional activation process itself, because that is a process of embodiment. And then I'd love to hear from Jonathan afterwards. And what I heard you say, part of what I heard you say, Preston, is that maybe we don't fault the digital, the virtual, so much as recognize that we are all coming from places where we have our own belief structures, worldviews, and as long as those are all separate, then the virtual space can take on a high degree of dysfunction. But if we're on the ground all becoming more bioregional and embodying that, then that will show up here as well. I don't know if that is maybe I'm misconstruing some of what you just said, but that's a really interesting thought anyway. I think that the communication that we're able to achieve, the coordination we're going to be able to achieve in the virtual will only get better as more people here are embodied in place, are adapting into a bioregional worldview and way of being. But just to briefly say that the bioregional activations were probably, and I wish I would have used this example off the bat, because this is a great example. It's the biggest shift that's occurred to me in terms of how I experience the world in a very long time. So when I joined Joe and Penny in Paonia and Carbondale, I've been having these bioregional conversations in the Bioregional Catalyst for 2 years. I've been thinking about this stuff a lot. I read Santok, I read a bunch of Peter Berg stuff. I read Dwellers in the Land, had been researching limits to growth, Danella Meadows. I was steeped in this stuff, but I hadn't had the actual experience of what it could be like. So when I walked through communities and tried to envision it, when I walked through places, it was just an idea. But then when I went to Paonia, Joe started off by giving this very compelling talk on the story of collapse, which draws people in, right? Like it makes them want to adapt away from this existential risk. And then he shares the story of a regenerative future through bioregionalism, forming a planetary network of bioregional learning processes. And that's the vision that inspires us forward. And I felt this sense of the whole community being like, yeah, that is what, like, that sounds great. We're all in together. And that was a really interesting moment to see a whole room full of people that represented a community all in, right? That was a big shift in embodiment for me. Tough to articulate, but within that experience, you definitely feel it. And then the next day he introduced the common land model for landscape scale regeneration and pro-social, which are these two tools that really give people the idea that, oh, this is feasible, this is possible, because the limitations that I had in my mind are resolved by seeing and understanding pro-social as a way to form collaborative and effective groups. And it's backed by all this science, Eleanor Ostrom, managing common pooled resources. And then there's this landscape model that actually provides the common language for communities all over the planet to do this together and to learn this together, and for them to all communicate effectively with funders. So people were like, okay, not only do I have the story, but I feel the possibility. We're all in it. And then we went out onto the landscape and started looking around and talking about the landscape, and you have all these people who are just swelling with possibility. And that gave me the experience that bioregionalism is possible. And not only is it possible, but we're doing it right now. And that embodiment went so deep. I mean, I've been way more determined ever since then. Like I literally transcended myself and I work harder. I'm more passionate about it. I'm more excited because I've seen and felt the possibility. So that's probably the best experience or best example of embodiment that I can give. And you guys are about to experience it. So I'm very excited for all of you and excited to continue having this conversation as more of these activations happen, because I think it's an important one. Yeah, and I think I have probably talked enough for quite a while also. I don't know, Jonathan, if there's anything you want to say or others.
Well, first of all, thank you for that little bit of a detour to help me understand what you mean by a sense of embodiment. And, you know, for me, it's a bit of a challenge here because I live in a number of different worlds. But the one that's here is not one that's very familiar to me because we only, arrived here about 2.5 years ago. And I had never learned really anything about the Great Lakes or much about, we started to do some work around the story of place and the whole regenerative aspect. In fact, 10 years ago, we formed the Center for Regenerative Community Solutions before anyone, had a sense that you could actually talk about this that we knew of, because it was kind of coming from some distance away, and we were trying to bring it to bear on what we were doing at that point in the state of New Jersey. So, having been transplanted once again, and of course, my experience of life is that every so many years I've moved into a completely different environment. 9 years old, my mother took us to Mexico. And so any connection that I had with growing up in rural Maryland was completely lost. I don't know any of those people. I can't remember their names, except for the name of the principal of the school that I went to because it was named after them. It was called the K Hall School. But any of the kids that I played with, no idea. And then moving to Mexico from there led me into a whole different culture. I mean, and for a while I resisted it completely. The first 2 or 3 months I said, I'm never going to learn Spanish. I don't want to be here. Don't, you're forcing me into this situation. By the end of the 3 months, I was speaking Spanish pretty much fluently. I had made some new friends. I was in school, and all that was kind of forgotten as I went forward into becoming a member of that community. And then we moved around in Mexico, half a dozen different places. So I have some memories now of Guanajuato, of Mexico City, of Guadalajara, and living in different places and engaging with different people. And part of it's helped by having gone back since then to visit a couple of places. When I tried to go back to Maryland to visit, I couldn't find anything that looked like what I'd grown up with. And I was told, well, that's not too surprising because it's all been paved over. It's now the community of Columbia. And so you're never going to find what was there before. But, that's just kind of continued on through my life to the point where once I have left something behind, it's hard for me to even maintain relationships back there. And that's a little frustrating. I think we're doing a little bit better job holding on to some of our connections in New Jersey, having moved to New York. But again, it's a kind of a sense that there's a different vibe around here, and there's a different way of relating to people around here. And that is becoming intensified by having gone into this bioregional initiative and getting to know some of the people who we had just kind of met peripherally, but who have now become integral parts of this initiative and who we're getting to know in a much deeper way. At the same time, I still feel like a planetary citizen and not a citizen of the Great Lakes bioregion. And as we have been talking, mostly the image that I have is that of spaceship Earth out, riding around in the cosmos, and having a sense of this planet's not, there's nothing that is going to come to an end other than me personally and perhaps the species, but the planet will continue on. There's really no issue around that unless we manage to somehow blow the atmosphere off of the surface of the Earth with nuclear bombs. And I understand that potentially that could happen. But in fact, I think that it's more likely that life will continue to sustain itself and it can keep losing members. And that doesn't really matter. It just continues on evolving new forms, new expressions. And so that's what I have as the sense of myself. I happen to be standing right now in the Great Lakes bioregion, but it's almost as if I could stand anywhere on the planet and feel much the same way. So I don't know if that's helpful or encouraging or discouraging, and if people have any insights that they want to share with me about how it's working for them. But that's my experience.
It's making me think about the sort of adaptability and mutability of being human, that we're wired. We can be dropped. You could be dropped into, an Eskimo village in 1723, and 5 years later, you'd be Eskimo or something like that, right? Just because of that mutability. And so we've created something here that allows some of us to create a virtual relationship set. And God knows what that's doing.
I can echo a lot of John's reflection, and I think it's a lot to do with being a settler culture in a place where the land was not ours. I've said to a few people before, my formative years were in Alberta, in rural Alberta. My father grew up on the farm, so I was only one step away. And then I went off to city of Calgary to get a degree. I was very excited actually to leave that framework because it never felt like community specifically for me. So the idea of being land-based or reflecting the land has only very, very recently began. And again, more through that aspect of, I went back in 2018 and started my master's degree after being out of school for a few decades. And the thing that actually surprised me more than anything else, I did a master's in evolutionary anthropology. What more surprised me than anything else was how strongly the conversation about indigeneity and, frankly, anthropology's role in eugenics, in the whole aspect of genocide, ecocide, everything that has unfolded for the past couple centuries. And so as much as I was doing a master's in one thing, I was actually very much learning something completely different. And then what I did is I took that, and because I own a piece of property here at the moment in Toronto, I was looking at the backyard and just thinking about how do I re-indigenize this space? How do I make it survivable, just in the sense of the extreme events, weather events coming? It's 18 feet wide and we'll have a huge amount of rain and there's a flat roof. Where's that rain going to go? And half the stuff in the backyard's dying already because of extreme heat. And so I just sort of began spending time in the backyard about how can I just do my space the way I want to do my space. And eventually all these things all began to intersect And I only realized it as I was doing it, how much they were intersecting. And then discovering Joe was coming in this direction early December, I just went, wow, this is a very serendipitous set of moments. And so, yeah, a lot of reflection on the people who had this stewardship front and foremost all those years. And so a lot of all those decades, millennia, that's why a lot of the focus I've been doing is in that direction, because there's so much of those answers, those solutions, those stories that are still really in so many ways at the periphery at best, frequently presented to us in narratives that are confrontational, that align with national security interests, all kinds of really dark storylines that don't necessarily need to be those dark storylines. And hence, again, that conversation about the constructs that we're handed through our education systems, through our media, through the conversations with people up and down the street, and trying to change some of those narratives, those perspectives. And so, yeah, it's a very hard journey, I think, to become reflective of the land. At the moment, haven't put much focus into what specifically bioregionalism is here, because I know that's going to come through this process anyway. So instead, I've been focusing on who can I reach out to, who might be interested in this storyline, in this framework, in this process. Because just trying to pitch this idea is a pretty hard pitch to people that don't have enough tools to begin to understand it in a 30-second elevator pitch. And all you really get in dense communities like this is very short periods of time to make those bridges, or to spark that little bit of interest in the eyes. We're like, oh, I caught your attention. Now maybe we can take this one little step further. Yeah.
So to me, this is an opportunity to once again explore the value of embodiment, because I think it presents an opportunity where we don't have to explain. We don't have to explain all of the conceptual building blocks that can allow somebody to get to the point where they understand bioregionalism. This bioregional activation process provides the setting, the context where people can just walk into it. And as long as they know a little bit about ecology, as long as maybe they sense that there's something wrong with the world, and they're open, they've got a degree of openness and ready to receive something new, they can experience this together when the whole community is like coming together in conversation saying, yes, this is something that we're interested in. How can we move forward? And so that is a great example of, in my mind, I don't know, of the value of embodiment. Of the role of embodiment.
I think it's no coincidence that food is a doorway, into this process, because that's where the sense of connection is sort of most immediate, most irrefutable. Yeah, our food comes from somewhere, and without that somewhere, we die. And so those kinds of irrefutable realities become a springboard. And then you can find people that are already thinking about those things, and then like just recently, I've been, there's a group of folks live down live down the road, and they've done two things. They are borrowing a chunk of land from a local farmer and growing nut trees, mostly hazelnuts and walnuts and chestnuts, which is a different kind of animal altogether. But and then distributing those to anywhere where the nuts will fall on public land, basically. So anyone who wants a nut tree, where it will fall in a place where it can be gathered publicly, can have free nut trees. And so they've been sort of it's just like a little doorway. And then they have volunteer work parties, and we go out and plant nuts and transplant and move stuff around. And then the side gig they do is they built they're actually part of the rainbow gathering community, which is a very wacky Northwest thing, where basically it's like Burning Man before Burning Man, and not in the desert, in a way. And they didn't burn anything except for a lot of weed, probably. But but they would basically they had figured out how to create wood-fired community kitchens, so that they could feed hundreds of people using locally found energy sources and whatever they could gather within the local farming community, and then just feed hundreds of people. And they actually refined that technology enough that now they're looking developing a sort of anarchistic, crowd-funded disaster relief institution called the Altruist Relief Kitchen, or ARC, ARC, or ARK, if you ever look at it, Altruist Relief Kitchen. And they're basically trying to build a way that they can be crowd-funded to go feed people wherever people need feeding, and train people how to build portable wood-fired kitchens, where you can basically burn post warfare scrap in 55-gallon barrels, in a clean and efficient way, and turn old beer kegs into soup tureens, in this wood-fired stove. So these are there's doorways, I think, and that it's like prying someone away from it's like cities. I think it's a great quote I read recently about cities are the human equivalent of feedlots in terms of just structurally, no judgment. Structurally, that cities function in the same way that a cattle feedlot functions in terms of its systematic structure and operations. And so to pry someone from that and say, no, actually, you're really vulnerable here. We're all really vulnerable here. I don't know. I think I don't know what it means to step out of that. It's a big deal to accept vulnerability. That's a huge step. And I've always wondered, like, what does it mean? That's why I've how do I create doorways where people can step into, and maybe that's the virtue of the virtual world, is that it sort of pulls you into a virtual world where anything's possible, or everything's different, at least, and then allows you to have thoughts beyond kind of life in the feedlot. But it's like part of the challenge is life outside the feedlot has some edges to it. It's really rough, when you think about making a living as a community on the land, and we have spent generations trying to escape that, and I talked to my family, and who left farms, and what that meant, and then sort of the whole, and then of course that was a particular kind of system. It's not just any farming system they were in. They were in a pretty unprivileged position in society, farming, which most farmers throughout civilization, have been kind of roped into a pretty raw situation. So there's just a lot of baggage there, and it's to accept vulnerability with no offer of parachute or magic carpet or any is no, it's not a very kind gift in a way.
You stirred up a couple things in me. The first is a question of whether or not there's going to be any opportunities in these bioregional activations across the Great Lakes Basin for there to be breaking of bread. I don't know if there's any shared community meals planned. That'd be really interesting, because I think that there's an interesting opportunity there. And the other thing that's coming up is related to this fascinating interview, two-part interview that Joe shared with me. It's been circulating around the community a little bit the last week or so between David Sloan Wilson and two other evolutionary biologists. And they talk about the evolutionary patterns and dynamics of cooperation in great depth. It's fascinating. It's very academic, deeply intellectual, but it's just chock full of insights. And regarding your invoking of the challenges of farming, of agrarian culture, when we come into collaboration, and you're talking about vulnerability as well, when we come together, when we leave the city, when we leave the feedlot, when we come together in collaboration, they talked about how these scientists, I'm forgetting the name, Terrence maybe, was talking about how, what is the impulse to do that? What gets us there? There's a certain, he talks about a certain ratcheting effect where when we come into collaboration, we experience benefits. And those benefits are what keep us together, because we can't imagine going back to more individuated forms of being. But it also brings with it vulnerability, because we are in codependence with others. And so I think as long as the benefits, we make sure that the benefits outweigh the vulnerabilities in some sense, or in our own perceived balancing, our own perceived equation of those, it makes sense to us, we can come together. There's all sorts of other things that we could talk about regarding like the opportunity to reapproach rural agriculture, agroforestry in a more coordinated way, and share best practices and avoid, more feudal, awful serfdom type situations, like really difficult farming realities. I think that there's an opportunity with the virtual medium to make the best of a new rural existence. That's a whole nother topic, and maybe I've brought in too much, but see what you did to me, Paul. You just introduced so many good things. I don't even know what to do, but I think I'll leave it at all of that. And Jonathan, are there opportunities for breaking bread in Rochester or beyond?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. Where the whole trip with Joe and Penny ends up is at a potluck breakfast or brunch at our house. And potlucks have been a very important part of all the community organizing that we've done, because it gives people an opportunity to contribute, and it somehow breaks down all suspicion or lack of trust among people, because you basically bring your food together and then you trust that you're not going to be poisoned by eating somebody else's dishes, and they trust that they're coming to be in a convivial atmosphere with you. And so that's been, something that's been central to us. So just that was the first kind of reaction that I had in terms of you're saying that. And it seems to me that it also helps to bind people together. That once they've been in a certain place together and they've had the opportunity to share food, to share ideas, to share feelings, and projects and aspirations, then you can kind of see who really wants to be part of the team, and who's just kind of come along to kind of check things out. And that to me builds community. So Victoria just dropped off in. And I'm comparing that to what it's like having purchased a house on a little street and having gone around to all of the neighbors on our street and the adjacent two streets that form kind of a little enclave within the neighborhood. And just, the varied responses that we get from people, mostly kind of friendly but distant, but some people are very suspicious. What the hell are you coming around talking to us about this for? And we created a little flyer with a picture of Victoria and I on the flyer, inviting people to participate in a garage sale to start off with, and then opening up the possibility of, neighborhood resilience. And I think we're slowly getting to know a few people, but basically, people are busy living their separate lives. And it does not, in a sense, occur to them that there is anything to do right here other than take care of their own lawn and driveway and, vehicles in and out. And so, I don't really have a sense of a community here, even though it's sort of theoretical. It's not, as you would say, embodied. It's a theoretical set. I mean, we live in a particular suburban town called Brighton, and it's quite a progressive little town. They not only don't have any problem with what we're doing with our lawn, doing the sort of lasagna mulch thing and getting rid of all the grass, they're actually encouraging this. And they have adopted Doug Tallamy's Nature Knows Best, or whatever. I forget what his couple of his books are, but and this is a movement that's beginning to catch on. We're just the first folks in our neighborhood to do it. And the town is quite, positive about what we're trying to do. And so that gives us a warm sense, but at the same time, I don't feel that I know my neighbors well enough to know whether I can even trust them. But I know the people in Earth Regenerators who know that I can trust them. So the virtual community in some ways has become a stronger community and a more immediate community than anything around us other than just direct family, which I think is interesting in itself. So, and one of the concerns that I have as things collapse is, will we be able to continue our virtual engagement with each other? Or will the communication systems we've created around the planet disintegrate as well? So that's a question I'm still kind of grappling with.
We'll send letters by sailboat.
I was just thinking with that conversation, the term transactional, for referenced a few times by other people, are our society. Similarities between Canada and the US is so transactional that every interaction we begin to engage in with somebody we don't know, we are concerned about how to defend ourselves against. Here comes the person with the clipboard. How do I say no? How do I get them turned around? How do I get them away from my door, not taking up my time? And so that's the fight we are so frequently up against internally within this framework. And that's where this sort of virtual environment like this and breaking bread is exactly the opposite of that. It is time with another purpose to have nutrition, to exist within a very vulnerable state, to be there with other people doing that same thing with no other intention there. And so all those aspects of heavy negotiation, of conflict, of potential guarding of self, all that gets to fall away for a while. And you get to be somebody that is more your inner self, and everybody else gets to be that as well. So yeah, to me, it seems absolutely, it's absolutely critical. I love walking around this community. I have a dog, so I spend a lot of time outside walking. And I was a student for 3 years. So, any break, you're trying to be more leisurely walking around and trying just to get into conversations with people. And I'm an introvert, so it's not something I try very often. But watching those layers of barrier about why are you talking to me that people immediately have, and not blaming people for that and sort of letting it be where it's difficult. And it's fascinating watching those types of interactions. And I'm hoping these types of things can begin shifting a lot of that away. Actually, I think emergency situations, and Mitty mentions in one of the conversations, she's sort of thrilled about things hitting crisis at this point. Toronto here, the whole northeastern seaboard, and was it 2003 when we lost the power for like 3 days? This city was amazing. It was amazing because people had no chance to actually get really scared, and instead they were helping each other out. Restaurants up and down the street didn't have the ability to cook, except the ones that had gas stoves, and they had freezers that were thawing. And so they just started cooking food and inviting people to eat it if they could pay cash or otherwise. All of the frameworks of what society was fell away pretty fast, and people actually engaged in really amazing abilities to not be afraid. And it was so beautiful. But you only get those moments here and there. I think we do have that capacity if we don't get too worked up. Watching toilet paper not be available for weeks on end on the shelves here was the opposite side. People were hoarding it. And I'm like, I'm not going to hoard toilet paper, because that's what's wrong with this system is, everybody's stockpiling to survive. And then nobody gets to survive because we all stockpiled. And how long is that really going to last you anyway? I read recently an interview with anthropologist with a indigenous person about storage of food. And the guy said, I don't want to store my food in a space. I want to store my food in the belly of my neighbor, because storing my food in the belly of my neighbor means that I will get something back from him at some point in time. And the fact that the anthropologist was so confused by this framework, this was just primitive thinking. Well, we live in such different paradigms again that that's actually not primitive thinking. It's completely the opposite. It is collective thinking. We survive as a collective. If you're going to be naked out in the bush with a knife trying to secure your food, you're going to have a rough time. That's really not how humans function. We function in collective groups. It's about rebuilding those things.
So I'm going to bring this all the way circled back again then, because I've been struggling with the power of personal invitation, and when you remove sort of the transactional colonizing behaviors to which I'm so adapted, and what you're left with, I think, and this is my hypothesis now, is sort of guest-host relationships, where you're, and there's a whole system of guest and host relationships that we are still embedded in our memories and cultures. When you invite someone and then they become a guest, and then your obligation as a host, but then that means they may become a host in the future, and then you're the guest. And that sort of guest host sort of back and forth is, I've been struggling with trying to understand how to explain or describe the kinds of relationships I would like to embody. and so the guest host game is how I've arrived at trying to explain. And the reason why the explaining is necessary to me is, it seems like because of all of these things that we've been talking about, that in order to break through all of the sort of acculturation and create spaces where we can experiment with group formation, you have to invite someone. You have to use your personal capital as part of that invitation, and you have to promise that there's going to be a guest-host relationship. embedded in that invitation, on some level. You're saying, upon my honor, I am inviting you to participate in something in which I will treat you as my guest, and that becomes it's that doorway. But in some ways, to get people to all participate, say, that, and I want you to become a host. I want you to become empowered to, in the same way that I'm hosting you, I want you to be empowered to host others, not necessarily personally. And so but sort of, it's almost like I've created this whole rule book in order to try and say, okay, to get from here to there, here, try this. Here's my rule book that I'm operating from, and you can hold me accountable to my rule book, because that's sort of like a transitional, because we don't have a cultural rule book, to inform us. And so as sort of a prop, a short-term prop, I think I've been experimenting with offering my rule book, by which I'm inviting you as a way to try. It's just really bizarre, and I don't know what to make of it all. But I'm going to share my draft rule book, the Ecosystem Guild Handbook, in the chat. And at some point, it's such an active experiment now with me trying to explain to people, this is the world I'm inviting you to join, and these are the rules. And by joining this world, these are the rules you can count on me to try to embody, and what I'm asking you to embody by joining this weird world, which is this imaginary secret society where we go live in the forest and tend rivers. So anyway, it gets back to this idea of what's left when we strip away these things that we don't want. What's left, and then what there is something that requires relearning, and then how do we make that where the benefits outweigh the vulnerabilities, and to where it's just a fascinating process, I think.
Everyone froze.
My is multicultural weddings, where you get three or four different versions of what a wedding is supposed to look like. Do you bring a gift worth the value of the plate plus, the costs associated, hundreds and hundreds of dollars, or do you do a where everybody brings their own food? I can't remember the term there, but you were just discussing that. And the problem is everybody has their own frameworks for this. What is acceptable, what's unacceptable, what's rude, what's terrible, and trying to, without actually having dialogues around that, it's an impossible scenario to unweave. So that's where my immediate thought goes. Your rule book may not look anything at all like somebody else's rule book.
I can keep rambling short. There was an amazing interview with I don't know if anyone knows Dan Savage, who is a gay sex advice columnist who started out in Seattle here, but he was just interviewed on a national podcast. Ezra Klein at the New York Times has a podcast. So there's an Ezra Klein, Dan Savage interview, and he talks about the contribution of gay society to sexual consent. And because when two gay men meet and they want to engage in some kind of sexual activity, they have to figure out how to do it. Whereas if a man and a woman meet and want to engage in sexual activity, the prescription is pretty can be taken for granted more. And so there's actually this whole process in gay community about what are you into, and then that leads, and that's the beginning of a conversational process of getting to know each other sexually. And then what that has done, is all those concepts, are now being translated into hetero society, and so there's so I'm just thinking about that and transplanting that sort of attention and concept into the cross-cultural wedding, sort of metaphor.
Enthusiastic consent.
It strikes me that we don't have enough time, maybe this isn't true, to work out our new values and our value structures. Like, we have to come together rapidly, right, into new forms of collaboration and in effective groups. My assumption is that, you know, rediscovering and building value structures is a long process. So is there, you know, how else can we think about this that affords the necessary haste? And I'm sort of thinking about like the idea of friendship and how friendship has a much greater tolerance for there being differences in values, because you trust the person, you love the person, who they are. They can mess up otherwise. That's kind of where my head's going. Jonathan, I see your hand.
Well, I know we're kind of coming to an end here. And the thought that occurred to me is that one of the worlds that I, live in my imagination is that we are in the middle of a massive crisis. Like if we were living in Ukraine today, we would not think about how do we build trust, or how do we, explore our relative value systems. We'd have to make an instant decision. Do we trust this person who's next to me, or is he potentially going to harm me? And if I trust him, then how can I collaborate with him immediately to do something to ward off the danger that we face? And, from some of the reading that I've done about people in wartime situations, the entire, not just the social ethic, but almost everything gets changed. One of the things I read is there's almost no mental illness in the midst of war. Or at least, surely there is, but there's no sense of attention around that. Everybody is taken for who they are at that moment, and can they help or will they hinder? And in a sense, I think it's kind of like we don't see this chaos all around us yet, but I have the sense that it's coming. And so we're going to have to make those choices pretty quickly if we're still here. But I need to get going.
Yeah.
I don't know about other folks. And this has been a really interesting experiment for me in a conversation that doesn't have an agenda other than to see what it is that we can help to connect for each other with regard to this whole bioregional process, and in particular as you put out there, the keeping the fire burning for the love of the Great Lakes as a bioregion, which really in some ways is so critical to us as a part of the world which has 20% of the world's fresh water. Are we going to fall to squabbling, or are we going to figure out our relationships and our alliances and move forward together to shore up our defenses against what's coming? Anyway, that's where I'm at. And thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Well, thank you for joining, and please extend the invitation to your community members to join the remaining 4 campfires to create some new relationships, connections. I don't have a closing that tops that one. That's great, Jonathan. So I think I'll just leave it at that, and with the last minute, invite Preston and Paul if you have any closing remarks. No, Paul? Preston?
My thought is it's all about relational. And it's, you don't need laws when you have relationships. So when you start breaking down to one-on-one, one-on-three, small groups, everything can become very straightforward and very simple. And that's what this to me is all about. So very happy about it.
Yeah.
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 Pleasure to meet you, Preston, and lovely to talk to you again, Jonathan. And Benji, anytime you want to come visit,
We plan on it.
Yeah, so that's I'm excited to hear what the Salish Sea adventure might look like. I don't know. That's,
Me too. Me too. Sounds like summertime, somewhere thereabouts.
mhm.
Yeah. All right,
It's hard to
gentlemen.
get people to camp in winter.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
We're camping, huh? All right, sounds good. Let's do it. I'll bring my tent.
Great. Thank you
Thank
so
you all.
much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Take care.